In the dark vastness of space, humanity faced its greatest challenge yet. The HFY Confederation, with their sleek silver warships and advanced weapon systems, had decimated Earth's outer colonies in a surprise attack 3 months earlier. 50,000 lives lost in a single day. Admiral Hannah Park stood at the viewport of Earth's Central Command, her weathered face reflecting in the reinforced glass as she stared at the orbital shipyard ruins. At 58, she had served in Earth's defense forces for over 30 years, but never had she felt so helpless. "They've rejected our peace offers again," said General Ta behind her, his voice heavy. "Of course they did," Hannah replied without turning. "Why negotiate when victory seems certain?" The meeting room fell silent as the holographic display showed Earth's remaining fleet, a mere 17 vessels against the HFY's hundreds. "We need something they haven't seen before," Hannah finally said, turning to face the room of dejected officers. "Something unpredictable." Later that night, Hannah couldn't sleep. She walked through the massive scrapyard orbiting Earth, where decommissioned ships and space debris collected since humanity's first ventures into space. The station keeper, an old man named Da, followed her with a portable light. "Thinking of selling this junk for resources?" he asked. Hannah stopped, looking at the enormous collection of parts spanning decades of human space travel. Different designs, different technology bases, different engineering philosophies, all considered obsolete. "No," she said slowly, "I'm thinking of using it." Her proposal the next morning was met with disbelief. "Build a warship from junk." Admiral Jun almost laughed. "The HFY would destroy it in seconds." "Not if they can't predict what they're fighting," Hannah countered. "Every HFY ship follows the same design patterns. Their targeting systems are programmed to recognize known threats. But what if we create something their computers can't categorize?" Despite fierce opposition, resources were too scarce to ignore any possibility. Hannah received minimal funding and a small team of engineers willing to risk their reputations on her crazy gamble. Chief Engineer Juno Kang had worked miracles before, but this challenge tested even his legendary skills. "We're mixing technology that was never meant to work together," he complained as they assessed the scrapyard inventory. "That's exactly the point," Hannah replied. "I want systems that shouldn't work together." For 3 months, they labored in the orbital scrapyard. The hull came from 7 different vessels, spanning 30 years of design. The power core combined fusion technology with experimental solar collection panels salvaged from a research station. Weapons systems were cobbled together from infantry railguns scaled up to ship size, modified mining lasers, and conventional missile tubes. The result was hideous. Unlike the smooth, elegant designs of modern ships, the patchwork resembled exactly what it was: a jumble of mismatched parts held together by engineers' tape and stubborn hope. Some sections were painted military gray, others still bore corporate logos or civilian colors. The ship's profile changed depending on the angle, with bulges and protrusions where systems had been grafted on. When Hannah first presented the completed vessel to Earth's Defense Council, an uncomfortable silence filled the room. "It looks like," began Admiral Jun. "Like garbage," Hannah finished for him. "But appearances can deceive." Before the patchwork could complete its shakedown cruise, a communication arrived from the Galactic Council, the loose federation of spacefaring species that had thus far refused to intervene in the regional dispute between humans and the HFY. "They're demanding we send a vessel for joint military exercises," said General Ta. "It's a test. If we refuse, they'll claim we're uncooperative and deny our petitions for aid." "Send our newest destroyer," suggested Jun. Hannah shook her head. "No, we send the patchwork." "That's suicide," Jun protested. "They'll see how desperate we are." "They already know how desperate we are," Hannah replied calmly. "But they don't know what we're capable of when backed into a corner." 2 weeks later, the patchwork departed Earth orbit, crewed by volunteers and commanded by Captain Sun Woo Lee, a tactical prodigy who had lost her family in the HFY attack. The ship's departure was photographed by media outlets, and soon images of the ungainly vessel spread throughout human territories. The mockery was immediate and merciless. Social feeds filled with memes comparing the patchwork to floating garbage. Military analysts publicly questioned Admiral Park's sanity. Even the crew's families expressed concern and embarrassment. "Ignore them," Captain Lee told her nervous bridge crew as they monitored the reactions. "They'll understand soon enough." The patchwork's journey to the neutral exercise zone took longer than a conventional warship would need. Its mismatched engines struggled to maintain consistent faster-than-light travel, forcing them to drop back to normal space several times for adjustments. When they finally arrived at the rendezvous point, vessels from 12 different species already waited. The communication channels lit up with chatter as the patchwork approached, some curious, most derisive. "Human vessel," came the formal greeting from the Galactic Council flagship. "You are cleared to join Formation Alpha. Please transmit your ship specifications and weapon capabilities." Captain Lee smiled slightly. "Council flagship, this is Captain Sun-Woo Lee of Earth Vessel Patchwork. We look forward to participating. Our specifications are still being finalized." The diplomatic phrasing couldn't hide the truth. The patchwork was such a technological mishmash that traditional specifications couldn't properly describe it. As they took their position in the formation, a sleek X-ray observer vessel passed unnecessarily close, scanning the patchwork intensively. "They're trying to intimidate us," muttered First Officer Ju. "Let them look," Captain Lee replied. "They won't understand what they're seeing anyway." That night, as most of the crew slept, Captain Lee found Engineer Junho running additional system checks. "Worried about tomorrow's exercises?" she asked. Junho didn't look up from his work. "This ship is held together with hope and duct tape, Captain. Every system is operating outside normal parameters because there are no normal parameters for this configuration. That's what makes it brilliant," Lee said quietly. "The Axari expect us to think like them, to build better versions of conventional warships." But Admiral Park understood something important. "What's that?" Lee touched the mismatched bulkhead beside her. "Sometimes being underestimated is the greatest advantage of all." The next morning, as the Galactic Council prepared to begin the joint exercises, the massive view screen on the Patchwork's bridge showed the gathered alien vessels, all sleek, purposeful, beautiful in their deadly efficiency. "First exercise begins in 20 minutes, announced First Officer Ju. "Simulated combat against Council drones." Captain Lee nodded, settling into her command chair. "Let's show them what happens when humanity builds a ship from nothing but leftovers and determination." The first exercise began with a simple challenge. All ships had to navigate an asteroid field while under simulated attack from automated drones. Most alien vessels approached this with practiced elegance, their advanced navigation systems calculating optimal paths through the debris. The Patchwork, however, moved differently. "They're watching our approach vectors," Captain Sun-Woo Lee told her bridge crew. "Let's give them something unexpected." Instead of using standard navigation protocols, Lee ordered manual control. Lieutenant Ju at the helm grimaced but complied, flying the Patchwork in jerky, unpredictable patterns that made it look damaged or poorly controlled. In the engineering section, Chief Engineer Jin Kim watched system readouts with intense focus. Unlike the standardized control rooms of other vessels, the Patchwork's engineering bay resembled a workshop more than a military facility. Tools hung from magnetic strips on walls, and parts lay scattered across workbenches. "Power fluctuation in Section 3, called out one of Jin's assistants. "Expected," Jin replied calmly. "Reroute through the secondary buffer we installed yesterday." What none of the observing alien vessels could see was that the Patchwork wasn't just ugly, it was revolutionary. Jin had designed it with multiple redundant systems that could take over for each other in ways no conventional ship could match. As the Patchwork lurched through the asteroid field, the Council drones launched their first simulated attack, an electromagnetic pulse designed to disable navigation systems. On the Murian vessel beside them, All systems went dark immediately. The sleek ship began drifting, its backup systems too similar to the primary ones and equally vulnerable to the attack. Inside the patchwork, warning lights flashed as the main navigation console shut down. Switching to backup, Lieutenant Ju announced, but instead of activating a standard backup system, she slid away from her dead console and moved to a jury-rigged setup on the side of the bridge. An old mining vessel's navigation system that operated on completely different principles than military tech. "What is happening?" asked the Galactic Council observer who had been assigned to the patchwork. The tall, blue-skinned alien had been quietly contemptuous since coming aboard, but now watched with genuine confusion. "Adaptation," Captain Lee explained simply. The patchwork continued through the asteroid field without pause, even as other advanced vessels struggled to recover from the simulated EMP. In the second exercise, ships faced simulated weapons fire that would disable specific systems. When the patchwork's main weapons were targeted, Jin's team simply activated alternative systems cobbled together from salvaged parts. "Our primary railgun is offline," reported the weapons officer. "Switch to the modified mining lasers," ordered Captain Lee. The observer's antenna twitched in surprise. "Mining equipment is not designed for combat." "It is now," Jin explained as he entered the bridge. "We reconfigured the focusing lenses and power delivery. It's not as elegant as military-grade weapons, but it will melt through hull plating just the same." By the third day of exercises, the patchwork had drawn attention. No longer the joke of the assembled fleet, alien commanders began studying the strange human vessel more carefully. After a particularly challenging simulation, where the patchwork had outperformed several much more advanced ships, Jin found himself cornered by engineers from 3 different species in the station's dining area. "Your power routing makes no sense," said the chief engineer of the Trilarian vessel, a reptilian being with silvery scales. "You're mixing fusion drives with photovoltaic backup systems and what appears to be primitive chemical batteries." Jin smiled as he ate his meal. "That's exactly why it works. When your primary systems failed under the simulated attack, your backups failed too, because they're built on the same principles. Our systems are so different from each other that they don't share the same vulnerabilities." "But the inefficiency," protested another alien engineer. "Your power loss must be enormous." "It is," Jin admitted, "but we'd rather have 60% capacity across 5 different systems than one perfect system that can be completely disabled." Meanwhile, Captain Lee was summoned to meet with the Council Fleet Commander, a veteran from the Eldari species named Sorai. "Your tactics are unusual, Captain," the tall, thin alien said as they stood in the observation lounge overlooking the gathered fleet. "Thank you," Lee replied, though she knew it wasn't entirely a compliment. Soray's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, an expression of puzzlement. "Your ship appears to malfunction constantly, yet you continue to complete objectives. Your approach to the asteroid field was erratic, but the drones had difficulty targeting you. Your weapon systems are primitive, yet effective." Lee looked out at the patchwork, floating among the sleek alien vessels like a patchwork quilt among silk garments. "My people have always had to make do with what's available, Commander Sorai. When you can't rely on having the best technology, you learn to use what you have in creative ways." The next day brought the most difficult exercise yet, a simulated battle scenario where ships would face multiple attack types simultaneously. The assembled fleet was divided into teams, with the patchwork assigned to defend a hypothetical outpost alongside Eldari and Murian vessels. As the simulation began, Jin was in engineering when a genuine alarm sounded, not a simulation warning. "Coolant leak in Junction 14, called an engineer. Jin moved quickly, sealing off the section. This wasn't part of the exercise. It was one of the patchwork's actual systems failing under stress. "Reroute power from the forward sections," Jin ordered, "and get me the emergency patch kit." While other ships had automated repair systems, the patchwork relied on hands-on fixes. Jin personally crawled into the junction, wearing protective gear as he applied a specialized sealant to the leaking pipe. Over his communicator, he could hear the bridge crew reporting on the simulation battle. Despite the coolant problem, the Patchwork was performing well, using unconventional tactics to protect the outpost. Their targeting systems are looking for standard evasion patterns, Captain Lee was saying. Keep movements random. Ju, fly like you've had too much soju. Jin smiled as he finished the repair. The Patchwork might be held together with the spacecraft equivalent of string and tape, but its crew understood something the aliens didn't. Adaptability was sometimes more valuable than perfection. When the simulation ended, the Patchwork's team had successfully defended their objective with minimal simulated damage. As Jin returned to the bridge, still wiping coolant residue from his hands, he found Captain Lee in conversation with the Council observer. "Your engineer was making repairs during combat," the alien asked, clearly surprised. "Of course," Lee replied. "Systems break. We fix them and keep going." "Your other crew continued the mission without waiting for repairs to be completed. Why would we stop?" Jin asked as he joined them. "We built redundancy into everything. No single failure can stop this ship." That evening, as the fleet prepared for the next day's exercises, Jin and Lee sat in the captain's small quarters, reviewing performance data. "They're starting to understand what we've created," Lee said. Jin nodded. "Not just a warship, but a philosophy. Adaptability over specialization. Redundancy over efficiency." Admiral Park was right, Lee said, looking at the schematics of their unusual vessel. The Patchwork isn't just a ship, it's humanity's answer to technological disadvantage. Outside their viewport, the stars shone steadily in the blackness. Among the gleaming alien vessels, the Patchwork floated like a statement, ungainly and crude perhaps, but impossible to ignore and increasingly difficult to dismiss. The final day of the joint exercises began like any other. Crews ran system checks, commanders reviewed performance data, and the Patchwork continued to draw curious stares from alien engineers. No one expected it to become the most important day in recent galactic history. Captain Sunwoo Lee was on the bridge when the first real explosions lit up space around them. Not simulated weapons fire, but genuine energy weapons tearing through the Council flagship. "What's happening?" asked Lieutenant Ju, her hands hovering over controls. The bridge view screen showed 5 sleek black vessels appearing from behind the system's outer moon. HFY warships. Their distinctive swept-wing design and red energy signatures were unmistakable. "This isn't part of the exercise," Lee said, immediately activating ship-wide comms. "Battle stations. Those are actual HFY warships." The Council communication channels erupted with confused chatter as more vessels appeared. 15 HFY warships in total, targeting the unprepared exercise fleet. "The Council flagship is hit badly," reported the sensor officer. "Their engines are offline." Lee watched in horror as the HFY focused their initial attack on command vessels. The Council flagship, already crippled, took another direct hit and exploded in a silent flash of light. The Eldari command ship followed moments later. "They're cutting off leadership," Lee realized. "Standard HFY tactics. Remove command structure first." Within minutes, 3 more command ships were destroyed or disabled. The remaining vessels, suddenly without coordination, began responding individually, some retreating, others launching uncoordinated attacks that the HFY easily repelled. "Captain, we're receiving distress calls from across the fleet," said the communications officer. "No one knows who's in command now." Lee looked at the tactical display. With the Council leadership gone, the fleet was in chaos. The HFY were methodically picking off the most advanced ships one by one. "Open a fleet-wide channel," Lee ordered. "But Captain, we have no authority to." "Do it," Lee insisted. "Someone needs to coordinate or we all die." When the channel opened, Lee's voice was calm despite the destruction unfolding around them. "This is Captain Sunwoo Lee of Earth Vessel Patchwork. I am assuming tactical command of Allied forces. All vessels form into defensive groups and fall back to coordinates I'm transmitting now. There was a pause, then acknowledgments began coming in. With no higher authority left to contradict her, captains desperate for direction accepted Lee's leadership. In engineering, Jin Ken was working frantically to maximize the Patchwork's capabilities. Divert all non-essential power to shields and weapons, he ordered his team, and activate the experimental energy dampeners. The dampeners were salvaged from an old research project, designed to mask energy signatures from sensor scans. Jin had modified them to create a constantly shifting power pattern that might confuse targeting systems. On the bridge, Lee studied the Axari attack patterns. Unlike the exercises, these were trained killers with a clear strategy. They're targeting specific systems on each ship, she observed. Look how they hit engines first, then weapons. They're targeting computers or identifying critical systems. Can we use that against them? Asked Ju. Lee nodded slowly. The Patchwork doesn't have a conventional layout. Jin, are your dampeners working? Online now. Jin's voice came through the comm. Our energy signature is fluctuating like a ship with major system failures. Perfect, Lee said. Let's look wounded. Ju, take us directly toward the nearest Axari vessel, but make it look like we're struggling to maintain course. The helmsman looked uncertain but obeyed, sending the Patchwork on an erratic approach toward an Axari destroyer. On the view screen, they could see the sleek black ship turning toward them, its weapon ports glowing red as they charge. They're targeting us, reported the sensor officer, voice tight with fear. Hold course, Lee ordered. Weapons, prepare the modified mining lasers, but don't power them up yet. I want them to think we're defenseless. The Axari ship fired, a precise beam of energy that should have disabled the Patchwork's engine core. Instead, it struck an area of reinforced hull where Jin had installed salvaged plating from an asteroid mining vessel, material designed to withstand extreme heat and radiation. The ship shuddered violently, but sustained only surface damage. They hit our secondary hull plating, Jin reported from engineering. Minimal damage to underlying systems. The Axari ship adjusted aim and fired again, this time targeting what their computers identified as the Patchwork's weapon systems, but hit an empty section that only contained sensor equipment disguised to mimic weapon signatures. They're confused by our layout, Lee said with grim satisfaction. Now, weapons officer, fire everything we have. The Patchwork unleashed its strange arsenal. Modified mining lasers fired alongside scaled-up infantry railguns and conventional missiles. The combination created a chaotic attack pattern unlike anything in the Axari combat database. The Axari ship, its defensive systems programmed to prioritize conventional weapon types, couldn't respond effectively to the mixed attack. Mining lasers melted through hull sections while railgun projectiles penetrated their shields at unexpected angles. Direct hits, called the weapons officer. Their main power is fluctuating. Press the attack, Lee ordered, and send tactical data to the other Allied ships. Tell them to target Axari vessels in small groups, using varied weapon types if possible. Across the battlefield, the remaining Allied ships began rallying. Following the Patchwork's example, they formed into impromptu groups, coordinating their attacks instead of fighting individually. An Axari cruiser turned its attention to the Patchwork, recognizing the threat. 3 energy beams lashed out, striking different sections of the ungainly vessel. Hull breach in Section 4, reported Jin. Sealing emergency bulkheads. Weapons still operational? Lee asked. Yes, Captain. They hit hard, but our distributed systems are still online. Good. Return fire. The battle raged for nearly an hour. The Patchwork took heavy damage. Hull breaches in multiple sections, one engine completely offline, life support failing in the lower decks. But unlike conventional ships with centralized systems, the Patchwork's distributed, redundant design kept it fighting. Jin moved constantly through the ship, personally directing repairs, rerouting power through backup systems, and improvising solutions as new damage occurred. The modified shield generator is failing. An engineer reported as Jin sealed a ruptured power conduit. Bypass it entirely, Jin ordered. Reroute through the tertiary power bus and connect directly to the backup generator we salvaged from that Trilarian freighter. As the battle continued, the Axari advantage began to wane. 3 of their warships had been destroyed, and 4 more heavily damaged. The remaining Allied fleet, now fighting in coordinated groups under Lee's direction, pressed their attack. From the battered bridge of the Patchwork, Lee watched as the Axari vessels began to retreat. Their precision strikes had failed against the chaotic human vessel, and the coordinated response had cost them dearly. "They're jumping to light speed," reported the sensor officer as the Axari ships disappeared one by one. Silence fell over the bridge as the reality set in. They had survived. More than survived, they had driven off an Axari attack force that should have annihilated them. "Damage report," Lee finally said, her voice hoarse from shouting orders. "Extensive damage to all sections," Jin replied over the comm. "But we're still here, Captain." The ship held together. Lee looked around at her exhausted bridge crew, then at the view screen showing the aftermath of battle. Destroyed vessels, both Axari and Allied, floating in the darkness. "Send out recovery shuttles," she ordered. "Help any survivors." Hours later, as repair crews worked to stabilize critical systems, Lee stood in the observation lounge. Through the viewport, she could see the Patchwork, battered, scorched, with whole sections exposed to space, but sealed off internally. It was even uglier now than when they'd started. Jin joined her, his uniform stained with coolant fluid and burn marks. "We lost 23 crew members," he said quietly. Lee nodded solemnly. "Without them, we'd have lost everyone. The ship shouldn't have survived that battle, Jin." "But it did," he replied. "Because it wasn't built to be perfect. It was built to adapt and survive." Outside, the remaining Allied vessels had formed a protective perimeter around the damaged ships. The Patchwork floated at the center, no longer a laughingstock, but a symbol of unexpected victory. The emergency meeting of the Galactic Council looked nothing like the formal gatherings of the past. Instead of their grand assembly hall, the remaining council members met in a hastily converted cargo bay aboard the Murian support vessel, one of the few ships large enough to host such a meeting after the battle. Captain Sunwoo Lee stood before them, still wearing her damaged uniform. Behind her, Chief Engineer Jin Kim waited quietly, his hands bearing fresh burns from emergency repairs. "You assumed command without authorization," stated Counselor Vex of the Eldari, his tone neutral but his 4 eyes fixed intently on Lee. "Yes," Lee replied simply. "The command structure had been destroyed. Someone needed to coordinate our response." The 7 council members exchanged glances. In any other circumstance, a junior captain taking command of a multi-species fleet would face severe penalties, but the circumstances were far from normal. "Your ship," began a Trilarian counselor, "it should not have survived direct Axari attacks. Our preliminary analysis suggests it absorbed damage that would have destroyed vessels with triple its technological sophistication." Jin stepped forward. "The Patchwork wasn't built to be invulnerable. It was built to keep functioning even when damaged." "Explain," demanded the Trilarian. Jin looked to Captain Lee, who nodded for him to continue. "Conventional warships are marvels of integrated design," Jin explained. "Every system connects perfectly with every other. It's efficient and powerful. Until something breaks. Then the entire integrated design becomes a weakness because failure cascades through connected systems." He activated a small holographic projector showing the Patchwork's internal layout. "We built redundant systems that operate independently. When one fails, another takes over. Not as efficiently, but enough to keep fighting." The council chambers fell silent as the implications became clear. "You deliberately built an inefficient vessel?" asked a Murian counselor, his facial tentacles writhing in confusion. "We built a survivable one," Lee corrected. "The Axari expected to fight ships like yours. technological marvels with predictable designs and vulnerabilities. 2 days later, the patchwork became the center of unprecedented attention. Engineering teams from a dozen species requested permission to examine the vessel. Military strategists wanted detailed battle records. Reporters sought interviews with the crew who had survived what was now being called the Battle of Joint Point. Jin found himself leading tours of engineering sections he had once been embarrassed to show anyone. "This power routing makes no logical sense," said a Murian engineer studying the chaotic arrangement of conduits and cables. "That's intentional," Jin explained. "If an enemy analyzes our power signature, they can't predict which systems are critical because power routes change constantly." Captain Lee, meanwhile, spent hours in debriefing sessions with military commanders. "Your tactics violated every principle of space combat," said an Eldari admiral, reviewing footage of the patchwork's erratic movements during the battle. "Traditional tactics are designed for traditional ships," Lee replied. The patchwork needed a different approach. 3 weeks after the battle, with repairs to the patchwork still ongoing, a priority transmission arrived from Earth. Admiral Hannah Park's face appeared on the main view screen, her expression solemn but eyes bright with pride. "Captain Lee, Chief Engineer Kim," she began. "The Galactic Council has formally requested Earth's assistance in developing new defensive technologies based on the patchwork's design principles." Lee and Jin exchanged surprised glances. "The same council that mocked our ship now wants our help?" Jin asked. Admiral Park almost smiled. "They're calling it adaptive technology integration to save face. But yes, Earth shipyards are already implementing your design philosophy in new vessels." The Admiral's image was replaced by footage from Earth's orbital facilities. New ships were under construction, each one clearly inspired by the patchwork, but no two exactly alike. "We're not building a fleet," Admiral Park continued as her face reappeared. "We're building an ecosystem of vessels, each with different capabilities, different vulnerabilities, different strengths." Back on Earth, the change was already evident. The massive scrapyard that had birthed the patchwork was now a hive of activity. Engineers sorted through allegedly obsolete technology with new appreciation. Items once deemed worthless were cataloged as potential components. In a planning room overlooking the construction base, Admiral Park met with Earth's Defense Council. "The Axari expected us to try matching their technological level," she explained. "Instead, we're changing the rules of the game." On the main display, schematics showed 5 new vessels under construction. Each incorporated the patchwork's philosophy that applied it differently. One focused on communication systems, with 7 different ways to maintain contact with the fleet. Another emphasized mobility, with multiple engine types that could operate independently or in concert. "No 2 ships will have the same configuration," Admiral Park continued. "No 2 will have the same vulnerabilities. The Axari will never be able to develop standardized countermeasures." Meanwhile, aboard the patchwork, Jin was showing a young engineer from a world called Kresh through the engine room. "Why do you keep these mismatched components?" asked the Kresh engineer, pointing to a junction where sleek modern technology met clearly salvaged parts. "Now that your design is proven, surely you could replace them with superior equipment." Jin ran his hand along the salvaged power conduit, a relic from humanity's first interplanetary vessels. "The mismatch is the point," he explained. "If we standardized everything, we'd lose our advantage. The patchwork works because it's unpredictable, even to us sometimes." On the bridge, Captain Lee was reviewing the report she would deliver at the next council session when a junior officer approached. "Captain, you have visitors." Lee looked up to find 3 Axari standing at the bridge entrance, the first Axari to officially board a human vessel since the conflict began. Their silver skin gleamed under the lights, and their elongated eyes carefully avoided meeting anyone's gaze directly. An Axari display of respect. "I am Observer Krell," said the lead Axari. "My government has sent me to learn." Lee gestured for them to enter. "You could have learned without attacking us." True, acknowledged Krell. A miscalculation. Your vessel was deemed insignificant. This assessment was incorrect. As the Axari delegation toured the patchwork, other changes were happening across known space. The Eldari, historically committed to technological purity, began incorporating mixed technologies in their new designs. Trilarian ships, once famous for their symmetry, now featured deliberate asymmetry to confuse targeting systems. 6 months after the battle, the patchwork returned to Earth, escorted by an honor guard of vessels from 5 different species. As they approached the orbital stations, Jin joined Captain Lee on the bridge. "They're building a monument," Jin said, pointing to a structure taking shape near Earth's main shipyard. Lee zoomed in the viewscreen to see the monument, a replica of the patchwork cast in metal, surrounded by the flags of all species who had fought alongside it. "Not bad for a ship made of junk," Lee said with a small smile. "Not junk," Jin corrected. "Just misunderstood potential." As the patchwork docked, they could see the new Earth fleet taking shape. Dozens of vessels, each unique, each incorporating the lessons of their unlikely flagship. Not the most beautiful ships, not the most efficient, but perhaps the most difficult to defeat. Admiral Park was waiting in the docking bay, standing straight despite her age and the cane she now used. Behind her, engineers and officers from a dozen worlds waited to greet the crew of the vessel that had changed galactic warfare forever. "Welcome home," said the Admiral, saluting Captain Lee. "Your ship has taught us all an important lesson." "What lesson is that, Admiral?" asked Lee. Hannah Park looked past them at the patchwork, its scared hull now worn like a badge of honor. "That greatness doesn't come from perfection," she said. "It comes from adaptation." 5 years passed quickly for humanity. The orbital shipyards around Earth, once centers of standardized production, had transformed into what many aliens called organized chaos. Where identical vessels once took shape, now 100 different designs evolved simultaneously. Admiral Sunwoo Lee stood at the viewport of her office aboard the patchwork, watching the final preparations of the junk fleet. Her hair had more gray now, and a scar ran across her left cheek, a souvenir from the Battle of Joint Point that had made her name famous across the galaxy. "They're coming," said Jin Kim as he entered, no longer needing to knock. 5 years as her second-in-command had made formality unnecessary between them. The long-range sensors detected them. Lee asked, though she already knew the answer. Jin nodded. "Axari warships, at least 200. They'll reach our outer defense perimeter in 18 hours. Lee wasn't surprised. Despite the Galactic Council's efforts at negotiation, the Axari had spent years rebuilding their forces. Intelligence reports had warned this day would come, a massive assault meant to crush humanity once and for all. "Send the signal," she ordered. "All ships to deployment positions." Across Earth's solar system, 100 vessels of the junk fleet received the call. Unlike the sleek, identical warships of other civilizations, each of these ships told a different story through its appearance alone. The Reclaimer had been built around the salvaged core of an Eldari cruiser, but its outer hull incorporated panels from 15 different species. The Ghost was nearly invisible to standard sensors, its systems cobbled together from stealth technology borrowed from 3 different worlds. The Thunderchild bristled with weapons, some purchased legally, others acquired through less official channels. No 2 ships were alike. No 2 had the same strengths or weaknesses. Each captain had personally helped design their vessel, ensuring it matched their tactical preferences. On the patchwork itself, now serving as the fleet's flagship, Lee addressed her captains through a secure communication channel. "The Axari believe they know what they're facing," she told the assembled commanders. "They expect us to have built traditional warships, bigger, stronger versions of what they've seen before. They're wrong." The faces on the screen, human men and women who had trained specifically for this kind of warfare, nodded in understanding. "Remember your training," Lee continued. "Standard tactics won't work against superior numbers. Use your ship's unique capabilities. Be unpredictable. Support each other. The Axari expect a battle. Give them chaos instead. 16 hours later, the Axari fleet emerged from lightspeed at the edge of Earth's solar system. Their formation was perfect, wave after wave of identical black ships arranged in textbook offensive patterns. Admiral Kovar, commander of the Axari forces, stood on his flagship's bridge with cold confidence. The humiliation of the skirmish at Joint Point still rankled. But this would be different. This was a proper invasion force, not a raiding party. Human vessels detected ahead, reported his sensor officer. Approximately 100 ships in defensive formation. Kovar studied the tactical display. The human vessels were positioned to defend the jump points leading to Earth. Only 100 ships, he said with a dismissive gesture. Begin the attack sequence. Standard protocol. The Axari fleet moved forward in perfect unison, weapons charging as they approached optimal firing range. What they didn't understand was that the junk fleet had already begun its attack. Aboard the reclaimer, Captain Minho activated the salvaged Eldari sensor array, a system the Axari would recognize and instinctively target first. As expected, 30 Axari vessels adjusted course slightly, their weapons locking onto the familiar signature. They took the bait, Minho reported to Admiral Lee, proceeding with Phase 1. As the Axari focused on the reclaimer, 3 seemingly unarmed transport vessels quietly moved behind an asteroid field. These ships, codenamed Trojans, carried no conventional weapons. Instead, they released thousands of small drones built from salvaged mining equipment. The drones attached themselves to Axari ships like remoras on sharks, not damaging them, but subtly altering their energy signatures. On the Axari flagship, confusion spread as sensor readings became unreliable. Some of our vessels are showing power fluctuations, reported an officer. Targeting systems are having difficulty distinguishing between our ships and the human vessels. Kovar frowned. A temporary issue. Begin the main assault. The Axari fleet fired its first coordinated barrage, a wall of energy that should have devastated the human front line. Instead, something impossible happened. Half the human vessels simply disappeared from sensors. Others seemed to absorb direct hits without damage. Still others split into multiple signatures. Confusing targeting systems. What is happening? Demanded Kovar. On the Ghost, Captain Jinsu smiled as her ship's experimental cloaking system, cobbled together from 3 different technologies, performed exactly as designed. While the Axari sensors searched in vain, her vessel slipped behind enemy lines and began targeting the vulnerable engine sections of their rear ships. The battle quickly devolved from the Axari perspective. Their carefully planned assault fell apart as the human ships refused to behave according to any recognizable battle doctrine. When the Axari adjusted to target ship engines, they found their targets had redundant propulsion systems. When they attempted to jam communications, the human vessels switched to alternative communication methods, some using technology so old it was immune to modern jamming techniques. By the end of the first day, Admiral Kovar was facing a situation no Axari commander had encountered in centuries: the possibility of defeat. They should have fallen by now, he said, studying the battle reports. 35 Axari ships had been disabled or destroyed, while only 12 human vessels appeared to be out of action. On the patchwork, Admiral Lee coordinated the ever-changing battle strategy. Unlike traditional command structures where orders flowed from top to bottom, the junk fleet operated on a principle Jin had named guided autonomy. Each captain knew the overall objective, but was free to adapt their approach based on the immediate situation. The Axari are regrouping, reported Jin, studying the tactical display. They're abandoning their standard formation. Lee nodded. They're learning. Signal all ships, begin Phase 3. Phase 3 was something no traditional military would attempt. A complete role reversal mid-battle. Ships that had been playing defense suddenly launched aggressive attacks. Vessels that had appeared heavily armed revealed themselves to be decoys, while seemingly unarmed transports unveiled hidden weapon systems. The battle raged for 3 days. The Axari, with their superior numbers, should have prevailed. But their standardized approach proved their undoing against an enemy that constantly adapted and evolved. On the third day, Admiral Kovar faced reality. Nearly half his fleet was disabled or destroyed. The remainder were running low on resources after the extended engagement. Most crucially, his crews were exhausted and demoralized, having fought an enemy that defied prediction. "Send the signal," he finally ordered. "Cease fire and open communications." Aboard the Patchwork, Admiral Lee received the Axari transmission with quiet satisfaction. "They're requesting terms," Jin said, hardly believing it himself. The bridge crew, tired, some injured, but undefeated, exchanged looks of stunned joy. Hours later, as the formal surrender was arranged, Lee stood on the Patchwork's observation deck. Through the viewport, she could see the battered ships of the junk fleet interspersed with the sleek but damaged Axari vessels, a visual representation of two fundamentally different approaches to warfare. Jin joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "The Galactic Council is calling it the most significant shift in power dynamics in 500 years, he said, handing her a cup. "Humanity is being formally recognized as a major galactic power." Lee sipped her coffee, looking at the Patchwork's reflection in the glass. The ship had been upgraded many times over the years, but she had insisted on keeping some of the original mismatched hull plates visible, a reminder of where they had started. "Not bad for a species that couldn't even build proper warships," she said with a small smile. "That was our strength all along," Jin replied. "We never tried to build proper warships. We built improper ones instead." As news of the Axari's surrender spread across Earth and its colonies, celebrations erupted. The species that had once been dismissed as technological primitives had prevailed against one of the oldest spacefaring civilizations. In shipyards across the solar system, work continued on new vessels for the expanding junk fleet. Engineers from a dozen alien worlds now worked alongside humans, learning and contributing to the evolving philosophy of adaptive design. The Patchwork itself, scared but victorious, took its place at the center of Earth's orbital defense platform. No longer a desperate gamble, but a symbol, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't perfect technology, but the creativity to use whatever tools are available in unexpected ways. The end.